In February 1967, in a remote outpost in the jungles of South Vietnam, 300 South Korean Marines were about to be attacked by a force more than 3 times their size. The enemy had chosen the target carefully, a small, isolated base, far from easy reinforcement, held by soldiers from a country thousands of miles away, fighting in a war that was not their own. It looked like an easy victory. It was the worst decision the attackers would ever make, because the men in that outpost were not ordinary soldiers. They were South Korean Marines, the Blue Dragons, and what they would do that night, in the firelight and the chaos, with bayonets and entrenching tools and their bare hands, would become a legend that the United States Marine Corps itself would study for decades to come. This is the story of the Battle of Tra Binh Dong, and this is how 300 Korean Marines destroyed an enemy regiment and refused to break. To understand why Korean soldiers were fighting in Vietnam, you have to understand the world of the 1960s. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War was escalating rapidly. The United States was pouring hundreds of thousands of troops into South Vietnam, trying to prop up the southern government against the communist North and against the guerrilla fighters known as the Viet Cong. But America was not alone. Several allied nations sent troops to fight alongside the South Vietnamese. Australia sent soldiers, New Zealand sent soldiers, and so did the Republic of Korea, South Korea. For South Korea, this was more than just supporting an ally. Only a little more than a decade earlier, their own country had been nearly destroyed in the Korean War. Their cities had been flattened. Millions of their people had died. They had watched communist armies pour across their border, and they had survived only because soldiers from many nations came to help them hold the line. Now they would repay that debt. They knew, better than almost anyone alive, what it meant to fight against a communist invasion. And they sent some of their very best troops to Vietnam to do it. Among them was the 2nd Marine Brigade, nicknamed the Blue Dragons. The Korean Marines had a fearsome reputation, and they had earned every bit of it. Their training was brutal, relentless, and uncompromising. Discipline was absolute. Physical toughness was not just expected, it was a point of deep national pride. A Korean Marine was taught that he did not retreat, did not complain, and did not surrender. He endured, he attacked, and he held. In Vietnam, they quickly became known for their aggressive patrolling, their willingness to go into the most dangerous areas, and their absolute refusal to give ground once they had taken it. The Viet Cong learned quickly to be cautious in the areas the Koreans controlled. Where other units might be probed and harassed, the sectors held by the Blue Dragons were approached with care and often avoided altogether. But in February of 1967, the communist forces decided it was time to teach the Koreans a lesson. They wanted to prove that the Blue Dragons were not invincible. They wanted a victory they could hold up for propaganda, a moment where the famous Korean Marines were crushed. So they went looking for an isolated Korean position, one they could surround, overwhelm, and wipe out before help could arrive. The position they chose was Tra Binh Dong. The base at Tra Binh Dong was held by the 11th Company of the Blue Dragons, around 300 men. It sat in a contested area, surrounded by territory where the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese moved with relative freedom. The base itself was a defensive perimeter. Trenches, bunkers, barbed wire, and carefully placed machine gun positions all dug into the red earth. The company commander was a Korean Marine captain who understood with complete clarity exactly how exposed his position was. He knew that if the enemy came in force, no one would reach him quickly. He knew that his 300 men might have to fight alone, in the dark, against far greater numbers. So he prepared for exactly that. He drove his men hard. They dug their trenches deeper. They strung more wire, layer after layer of it. They cleared their fields of fire so that no attacker could approach unseen. They sighted their machine guns to cover every approach, and they rehearsed over and over what each man would do if the perimeter was breached, where they would fall back to, where they would counterattack from, how they would seal a gap if the enemy broke through. His men sometimes resented the endless work, the constant digging in the heat, the relentless drills, repeated until they could be done in total darkness. To soldiers who were tired and far from home, it could feel like cruelty. Within days, every single one of them would be grateful for it, because the enemy was coming, and they were coming in strength. The communist force assembling against Trabin Dong was not a small band of guerrillas. It was a reinforced regiment. By most accounts, well over 1,000 fighters and possibly more than 2,000, drawn from hardened Viet Cong main force units and supported by North Vietnamese regulars. Against them, 300 Korean Marines. The odds were overwhelming, more than 3 to 1. By some estimates, closer to 5 or 6 to 1. On paper, it was not a battle. It was an execution waiting to happen. On the night of February 14, 1967, the attack began. It started, as so many of these attacks did, with a massive bombardment. Mortar shells and rockets rained down on the Korean perimeter, tearing into the trenches and bunkers, filling the night with fire and smoke, and a noise so total it drowned out everything else. The barrage had a purpose. It was designed to stun the defenders, to kill and wound as many as possible, and to keep the survivors pinned down with their heads below the parapet while the infantry crept in close through the darkness. And then the assault waves came. Hundreds of communist fighters surged out of the night, cutting through the wire, hurling satchel charges and grenades, pouring automatic fire into the Korean positions. They struck multiple sides of the perimeter at once, trying to split the defense, overwhelm it, and break through before the Marines could organize a response. But the Koreans were ready. Every hour of digging, every drill repeated in the dark, every harsh word from their officers now paid off in full. The Marines met the assault with disciplined, withering fire. Machine guns swept the cleared approaches, cutting down the attackers as they came. Rifles cracked from the trenches in steady, controlled volleys. Grenades arced out into the massed waves moving through the wire. The first assault was thrown back. Then a second came, and a third. Through the long hours of the night, the communist regiment battered itself against the Korean perimeter, again and again, feeding more men into the attack, accepting horrific casualties in their determination to break through. And in some places, they did break through. At several points during the night, the sheer weight of numbers told. The attackers found gaps, poured through the wire, and got into the trenches themselves. And at that moment, the Battle of Trabin Dong became something out of an older, more brutal age of warfare. It became hand-to-hand. Inside the trenches, in the dark, Korean Marines and Communist soldiers fought at arm's length, with bayonets, with rifle butts, with knives, and when those were lost or broken, with entrenching tools, the small folding shovels each Marine carried, their edges now swung as axes in the close, desperate dark. This was where the Korean Marines' training truly revealed itself. Close-quarters combat was something they had drilled relentlessly until it was instinct. They were physically hardened, aggressive, and utterly determined not to yield a single foot of ground without making the enemy pay for it. Where other troops might have panicked when the enemy got inside the wire, when the fighting became a chaos of shadows and screams, the Blue Dragons did the opposite. They counterattacked. There are accounts from that night of Korean Marines clearing their own trenches with cold steel, working along the line bunker by bunker, of small groups rallying in the darkness and charging straight into the breaches to throw the enemy back out, of wounded men refusing to leave the line, fighting on from where they lay. The company commander moved through the chaos, directing the defense, sealing off the penetrations one by one, throwing his small reserves into the most threatened points exactly as he had rehearsed. Slowly, savagely, foot by foot, the Marines fought to retake their own perimeter. And then, in a moment that has become central to the legend of Tra Binh Dong, the Koreans did something extraordinary. With the enemy inside the wire, with the situation hanging by a single thread, the Korean Marines reportedly fixed bayonets, rose out of their positions and launched a full counterattack into the very heart of the breakthrough, a screaming, headlong charge into a numerically superior enemy, in the dark, at close range, with cold steel. It was the kind of action that should have been impossible, a surrounded, outnumbered force, charging the very men who had broken into their lines. And it broke the back of the assault. The shock of being met not with retreat, not with panic, but with a bayonet charge driving into them sent the attackers reeling. Men who had pressed forward through machine gun fire without flinching suddenly found themselves facing an enemy who would close the distance and fight them with blades. The breaches were sealed, the trenches were cleared, and the perimeter, somehow, against all reason, held. As the night wore on, the defenders were also supported from the outside. Allied artillery fired in support of the Korean position, walking high-explosive shells around the perimeter to break up the enemy formations, massing for fresh assaults. Flares drifted down beneath their parachutes, turning the night into a flickering, ghastly, shadow-filled day, and aircraft arrived overhead to add their firepower to the defense, striking at the attackers in the open ground beyond the wire. But make no mistake, Tra Binh Dong was won first and foremost in the trenches, by the men who held them with rifles and bayonets and shovels at arm's length from their enemy. When dawn finally broke on February 15, 1967, the scale of what had happened became clear. The communist regiment had been shattered. The ground around Tra Binh Dong and inside the perimeter itself was littered with the bodies of the attackers. Estimates of the enemy dead ran into the hundreds. An entire regiment had hurled itself at 300 Korean Marines again and again through the night and had been broken to pieces against them. The Blue Dragons had held. Their own losses, though painful, were astonishingly light compared to the enemy. A relative handful of Korean Marines had been killed against an enemy body count many times higher. For a defending force outnumbered so badly, against an enemy that had broken clean into their position, it was a staggering, almost unbelievable result. The Battle of Tra Binh Dong became one of the most celebrated actions of the entire Korean involvement in Vietnam. The United States took notice. American commanders were deeply impressed by what the Korean Marines had achieved against such odds. The defense of Tra Binh Dong was studied afterward as a model, an example of how a well-trained, well-dug-in, and utterly determined force could defeat a far larger attacker, even after that attacker had penetrated the perimeter. Awards and honors followed. The unit's stand was recognized by both the South Korean and the American governments. Individual Marines were decorated for their courage in the night's fighting, and the reputation of the Korean Marines, already fearsome across Vietnam, became something close to legendary. For the communist forces, Tra Binh Dong was a costly disaster. They had set out to destroy an isolated Korean company, to prove that the Blue Dragons could be beaten. To win a victory, they could parade for propaganda. Instead, they had lost an entire regiment's worth of fighting power in a single night and handed the Koreans one of their proudest moments of the entire war. So why, today, do so few people outside of Korea know this story? Part of the answer is the sheer scale of the Vietnam War. So many battles, so many units, so many nations involved, that the actions of the Allied contingents are often lost entirely in the shadow of the enormous American effort, and part of it is simply that the soldiers who fought at Tra Binh Dong were not American, not Australian, not from any of the countries whose Vietnam stories are most often told in the English-speaking world. They were Korean. Their story was told and celebrated in their own language, in their own country, and rarely translated for the rest of the world to hear. In South Korea, the Blue Dragons of Tra Binh Dong are remembered with deep pride. Their stand is taught as an example of discipline, of courage, and of the warrior spirit of the Korean Marine Corps. They were men who came from a country that had itself been ravaged by war, who traveled to another nation fighting for its survival, and who, when surrounded and outnumbered in a remote jungle outpost, did not break, did not retreat, and did not surrender. 300 Marines against a regiment in the dark. And when the enemy came over the wire, they answered with cold steel, and they held their ground until the sun came up. That is the Battle of Tra Bin Dong, and that is why the men who attacked it made the worst decision of their lives. If this story moved you, then you understand what this channel is about, finding the battle's history left behind, the soldiers whose courage deserves to be remembered, no matter what flag they fought under or what language they spoke. In our next video, we travel deeper into the jungles of Vietnam, where a small patrol of Australian and New Zealand soldiers tracked an entire enemy force through the wilderness, using nothing but patience, silence, and a single set of footprints. The link is on your screen now. Subscribe to War Memory Files and we'll keep finding these stories, story by story, until none of them are forgotten.